Welcome everyone to Legal Talk with Stacy Clark. We have a great show today. Today my guest is Daniel Monahan, a lawyer who represents victims of sexual abuse in our region and seeks to get them justice, monetary or otherwise. Dan has been helping men, women, teens, and families for decades who have suffered the horrors of sexual abuse. They include victims of clergy abuse, abuse by a Boy Scout leader, a teacher, a coach, a medical provider, as well as victims of sexual abuse at the hands of someone at their workplace or nursing home. He treats every client with dignity and empathy and is known for being tireless in getting them some kind of justice for the abuse they have suffered. Dan's been named by Mainline Today as one of the best attorneys in the Philadelphia region. He also has received an AV preeminent rating by members of the bar and the judiciary, which is the highest possible rating a lawyer can obtain by Martindale-Hubbell, a peer rating review service. In addition, Dan is board certified in trial advocacy by the National Board of Child Advocacy, the only such organization recognized by the American Bar Association. So let's get started. We have a lot to cover. Dan, welcome.
Good afternoon, Stacy. Thanks for having me today.
It's great. Dan, you've been a trial lawyer for decades. When did you first become involved in representing survivors of sexual abuse?
First of all, let me thank you for having this topic today, because it's not only timely, but it's very important. Mm-hmm. It was about 11 years ago that a young man called me up and told me he'd been sexually abused while he was a grade school student at St. Aloysius Academy in Bryn Mawr, and then abused again when he became a high school student at Malvern Prep, an Augustinian organization in Malvern, obviously. I ended up, looking into that case. We eventually brought a lawsuit, and several years later, after significant discovery and investigation, we were able to get a very good resolution for him by resolving the case. And certainly a great deal of satisfaction for him, I think. Mm-hmm. So from there, that lawsuit was brought right around the same time that the Philadelphia grand jury came out with their second grand jury investigation on clergy sexual abuse within the Archdiocese of Philadelphia.
Right.
So in conjunction with that, I started receiving dozens, over 100 phone calls from survivors, wow, not only in Pennsylvania but across the country, who had been abused here, may have moved later. And then in 2020, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania came out with another grand jury report which encompassed all but 2 of the counties or the dioceses in Pennsylvania, and certainly that prompted even more calls.
So it's been a long time.
It has.
Really, and the floodgates really have been opened. So what's the biggest challenge that you face in these cases?
Well, the first challenge you're going to face in these cases, unlike maybe a lot of other personal injury cases, is confidentiality.
Confidentiality, okay, tell us why.
Well, you got to understand that oftentimes these survivors are coming forth decades after they were abused. They've been living with, shame, guilt, mm-hmm, embarrassment. You might be the first person they've ever discussed it with. And what happened to them when they were abused beyond the sexual abuse is their trust was violated. Mm. Because these predators aren't people that they were just strangers on the street that abducted them and took them into the woods or something. These were people they knew, trusted. They were clergy, they were friends of the family, they were doctors, they were coaches. So for them to just meet me for the first time or talk to me on the phone for the first time and reveal everything without some sort of assurance right from the beginning that this is confidential, because we don't know where the case is going at that point. Mm-hmm. They've got to know that. So first of all, I assure them that attorney-client privilege prevents any discussion of this beyond what they want me to discuss. If we decide to eventually go forward with the lawsuit, we protect them further, if they want it, with John Doe plaintiffs in the complaint. And that protects their name from being exposed in the public. Fortunately, most defendants I have found are agreeable to that, mm-hmm, and the press is certainly agreeable to that.
That's great to know. What are some of the other challenges or first steps in a sexual abuse case?
Well, like a lot of cases, you have to do an investigation. There's a certain amount of working with the client in the beginning because, again, they're damaged by years of abuse.
Yeah.
They come to me with, most times, addiction issues, alcohol abuse, psychological problems, and we need to make sure that they are stabilized and that they're getting the treatment that perhaps they haven't gotten up to that point. So there is some reaching out, even perhaps to the diocese, to pay for some of that treatment, which they will do, even if there isn't a lawsuit. Making sure that they get the treatment maybe through their own health care plans. So that's job number one. And there are national organizations they can go to, such as SNAP, which has been around for decades.
What is SNAP?
SNAP is Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests.
Oh, wow.
And this was started by a woman and a man, Barbara Blaine, who tragically died a couple years ago. But she had been abused as a 12-year-old, and she started this organization, and it's grown nationally. And of course, I deal with them a lot.
Okay, that's good to know. So what are some of so after you have met, investigated, triaged, if you will, what are the next steps normally?
Well, the next issue you have to deal with is statute of limitations, which is basically a fancy word for saying, you have to bring this claim within a certain period of time or it's barred by the courts. So there's 3 stages of that. Number one, for minors who are abused, currently they have until age 30.
Okay.
Somebody who's abused after their minority, they have 2 years from the date of the incident.
Okay, so adults have 2 years from the incident.
Right.
Okay.
Now there may be incidents
file
that
a
might be
lawsuit.
the last incident.
Yeah.
And thirdly, there's some hope on the horizon in Pennsylvania that a legislation will be passed with what they call a window. And a lot of states across the country have done this already.
Okay.
Delaware was actually the first. And they open up a 2-year period or 1-year period, and they say to the litigants, okay, you can come forward no matter how old this claim was, and if you bring it within this 2-year period, you can go forward and they can't raise that defense. That bill was recently passed. It may be up for a vote in May, but it may not. It may be delayed for another 2 years due to a technical difficulty.
So this is in the Pennsylvania legislature.
Correct.
So this would affect anyone who's a survivor in Pennsylvania.
Absolutely.
Who is outside of that time frame that you mentioned.
Right.
But the first thought, I think, would be to check with an attorney and say when the injury and abuse happened.
Right.
And then go from
because,
there.
And in years past, it's gotten even more complicated depending on because there have been different statutes since I've been practicing law, 18, 20, 30. So, you've got to make sure you've got the right dates.
Stay on top of all of the things. And what about medical treatment records and witness statements and investigations of the responsible person or institution, criminality that could be involved?
Right.
Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so assuming we're going to go forward with a lawsuit, and we don't always because maybe the client does want to do that. Maybe we have legal obstacles that we can't bring a claim. But in the meantime, we are investigating this case. We are getting past medical records. We are talking to family members if they have been involved. We are doing investigations into the perpetrators. There are some, in addition to SNAP, there's another great organization called Bishop Accountability, started by 2 individuals up in Boston that has cataloged for years every abuser, every grand jury report, every article of any Catholic abuser across the country, and I think maybe even the world. But that is a valuable resource because if the client knows the predator, we can go right to that source and get all the information about when the diocese or church knew, what they knew, whether there was a criminal case, etc.
Huh, that's fascinating. And, I hear a lot about expert testimony, you relying on medical records and doing some of this research. Walk us through the process of how someone who is a survivor understands what they have to pay for and what they don't have to pay for.
Okay. Well, first of all, these are all contingency cases. So
tell us what contingency
means. So contingency means there's no fee unless we get an award or a verdict or a settlement.
Okay, so
and then it's a percentage of that.
Nobody pays anything
right.
until
In addition
that
to that, there are significant costs, but we we pay those costs also. So we need to get experts. We may not only need medical experts, we may need liability experts. I'm in touch with people on, who are experts in security, experts in clergy law, clergy, history. There's a particular individual out in the middle of the country or actually in Washington that does that, Tom Doyle. So I'm in connection with all those people, and I also know some very good, experts, medical experts, not only here in the Philadelphia area, which has some good sexual abuse programs, but also Ann Burgess, for instance, in Boston, who's at least in the nation, she's well known because she was involved in the Atlanta murder cases, and she's had a lot of experience.
And what does she add to a typical case, someone like her?
Well, she has met with my clients to determine the impact that she's actually a nurse, but she's teaches a course in sexual abuse up, I think, in Boston and maybe even Penn right now.
Of course.
But she's able to meet with these people. She's very caring. I've had several clients who've seen her, and she'll give you an opinion as to what the long-term, what the impact has been and what it could be in the future for these survivors.
Boy, it's incredible what they have gone through and survived. You're absolutely right. We hear a lot about sexual abuse, not only of children, but of adults as well. Tell us about whether sexual abuse is confined to a particular type of institution or a sexual predator, and how can you spot and help avoid being in a situation where there is a predator?
Right. Well, unfortunately, it's, predators are equal opportunity abusers. It knows no bounds. It knows no economic or socioeconomic bounds. They are very cunning. They are charming. This is, like I said before, this isn't the guy on the sidewalk with a raincoat flashing somebody. This is somebody who's a trusted counselor, advisor, teacher, medical provider, clergy, Boy Scout leader, any institution that has unfettered access to survivors. And that may even be adults. That could be adults in a nursing home,
right,
who aren't protected by the institution from sexual assault by employees of the institution.
Right.
Last week, a 4-year-old was found to be sexually assaulted in Delaware and left for dead. Fortunately, she survived. Last week on 60 Minutes, if you've caught that show, Simone Biles, who apparently, I'm not a gymnast expert, but she apparently is the best gymnast in the world going for her 4th Olympic. And she finally revealed that she had been sexually abused by a known abuser, and there had already been a number of people that had come out against him, but she held back and only recently came forward. So
in her case, the abuser is in prison right now?
Yes.
And had abused multiple people on the U.S. Olympic team?
Yes.
Okay.
And in Pennsylvania, we had our Sandusky case, 10 years ago.
Just refresh our viewers' memories about what that
was.
was.
He was the football coach with Paterno, and he had started actually a foundation for children, which was a ruse to get I don't want to say underprivileged, but children in need to go to a summer camp, and then he was sexually abusing them. And only when he was discovered doing it by another coach or an assistant coach at the Penn State gym was he caught and prosecuted and convicted and went to jail.
So in that case, that wasn't a situation where the victims were coming forward, the survivors were coming forward first. It was actually the coach, the assistant coach, who realized that there had been abuse.
Yeah, I don't remember which came first, the chicken or the egg, whether he was the first one to expose it or whether somebody had come forward before, but he certainly had witnessed something that was untoward in the locker room between Sandusky and a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old.
Do you find that that's often the case, in that the survivors that you're representing are involved with someone who has a criminal background or who is in prison, or is that not often the case?
No, that is not often the case. The abusers typically haven't been convicted of this before. You would hope that if they were, that these institutions wouldn't have them in their employ. Not that that couldn't happen.
Right.
But no, for the most part, They may have been known to the institution. Certainly in the clergy abuse cases, the Catholic Church was well aware for years, decades even, going back to the 40s, that these guys were serial abusers. I mean, up in Massachusetts, which if you saw the movie Spotlight, really revealed that investigation by the Boston Globe. I mean, one or two priests had abused over 125 children.
One or two priests?
Yes. Each.
Sorry, I remember the movie really hitting home with all of this. Yeah, so when you have a new client walk in the door, what are their expectations? What are your hopes for the case? How does that materialize?
I don't think they know what their expectations are. They just want to explore it, and it's a very episodic, serial type discussion. They don't walk in and tell you the whole story, and this is what I want to do. They may tell you a little. You may meet them again. You got to keep meeting them. They may tell you a little more. They may tell you a little more to get the big picture. You've got to discuss whether or not they're willing and able, if the case has viability, to go forward with a case. And oftentimes I'm representing people for years that are never going to bring a case, but I try to help them as best I can, get them to therapists, get them what perhaps reparation that may be available to them that's not through the legal system. I mean, I've kept in touch with people that only recently contacted me that had contacted me back in 2010. So, it's a process, and it's not linear rather. It just depends on each individual person.
Have you seen some kind of a pattern with why someone decides to come forward and talk to you?
I would say most of them have reached a point where they just can't handle it anymore. Take, for instance, the first individual that called me. He was desperate. I mean, he was a college grad who had a good job, but he was falling off the rails. He was addicted to alcohol. He had severe psychological problems. He was alienated from his family because they didn't believe him. And he had lost his job, and he had no money. And he needed someplace to live, and he needed some money to get some food. And he was at the Archdiocese headquarters when he called me, and they wouldn't give it to him without him signing some documents. And he was afraid that he would be releasing something by signing the documents, and he certainly wasn't in the state of mind to be able to sign those documents and comprehend them. So that's what when he called me.
God, that case was something else, really, making such a difference in his life. Is there any one case that you've handled a lot of cases. I know your storied history. I know what a successful attorney you are. Is there any one case that you've handled that you want to talk about in terms of it became a great success for your client?
Right. Well, I think I think there's a huge catharsis, and not only for the monetary reward, but just recognizing that, or these survivors getting some recognition that it did happen to them, and they were harmed, and they were entitled to some compensation. I mean, I don't know if any compensation is ever going to, make up for what the harms and losses they suffered. And I've done more than clergy abuse cases. I've done Boy Scout cases, but recently, in the last couple of years, I was retained by residents of the Devereaux Foundation, which was started here in Philadelphia. They have offices all over the country. And she had been sexually groomed, and
your client
my
had been
client,
sexually groomed,
and then abused by a counselor who, and they knew about it because.
Let me just stop you for a second. We use the word groom to talk about a lot of different things. So what does the word groom mean in your story?
So grooming is, again, a process where they get to be familiar with them, and they try to push the boundaries. They may touch you, inappropriately. I mean, there was one priest who always would pull their pants, altar boys' pants, and say, that you look like you're gaining weight or you're losing weight. Let me put my hand down your pants, and they would just keep going farther and farther until, But if somebody stopped, well, then they'd move on to the next victim. And they're always looking for vulnerable victims. They're looking for children who come from broken homes. I mean, this particular individual we're talking about, Devereaux, her mother had died of an overdose. Her father had remarried. She was alienated from him. She was going from one house to another. She had a child, and they tried to do the right thing and get her involved in social services in Philadelphia, and then they stuck her in this place, and she gets abused again. So she was very vulnerable, and she and her father came forward to me, and through another attorney actually, and we were able to bring a very successful case. We learned that they had been warned that this guy had unnatural interest in her, and it involved buying her a phone, getting her gifts. I mean, these are kind of things that somebody who doesn't have those things, you know, they buy them a pair of sneakers, they're their best friend, and then they move on from there, or they tell them they love them. I mean, this is how the process starts. Now, in that particular case, we got a very good resolution in the Philadelphia court after a long settlement conference, and I'm happy to say that with that money, she has moved on. She's working. She's going back to school. She started out as a very shy person, but she's very bright, and bought a house in South Jersey. So I'm really happy that her life is going to move on in better condition.
Yeah. So what's going on in the Devereaux cases? I see it in the paper. I haven't been following it very closely. There still could be other survivors out there from Devereaux?
Absolutely, because they have multiple campuses just here in Pennsylvania. They have multiple campuses across the country. More cases have coming out, you know, even since I filed a case. I'm still wrapping up one case that I brought after the first case, and I'm sure there are other cases. I mean, we see it in a lot of other institutions. I mean, Glen Mills School had a number of cases. So it's not just the Catholic Church, it's a lot of institutions, and that's where we're not going to stop pedophiles. There's always going to be pedophiles.
Yeah.
But we can do something about institutions that refuse to take responsibility for them.
And what can we do?
Well, we can keep, you know, we can educate them. We can keep bringing lawsuits until they wake up and figure out that they should be doing the things to, you know, screen their, you know, employees or pay them better or, you know, whatever in order to, I mean, we could get into a long discussion about what the Catholic Church should do to reform, but I'm not going to go there.
Okay. But you've talked a lot about situations that where children are involved, or
Right.
where people who were teens had to survive terrible abuse and now are adults. Talk a little bit more about other kinds of cases that you might see in terms of folks being abused in their workplace or by a doctor, or some of the other places where adults may have seen something recently.
Well, I mean, again, it runs the gamut. I have Boy Scout cases where the Boy Scout leader was also a teacher, and you know, one told the other, but nobody ever did anything about it. I've had other teacher cases, you know, where some young girl who's 15 thinks she's, or 16 thinks she's in love with her teacher who's basically sexually abusing her. So it runs the gamut. I mean, there's just no institution that has any exposure to children that hasn't had some experience with this problem.
But you find it with adults as well.
Oh, absolutely,
right.
Absolutely. I mean, in the second Devereaux case, the woman is mentally challenged. She was 36 years old, but she was sexually abused by someone, even though she was, you know, she's got the mind
30s.
of a child. And again, you know, elderly patients. There's numerous cases of sexual abuse with nursing home patients, assisted living, you know, home health care.
Right. Those are the ones.
Any vulnerable. I mean, this is what they look for. They look for vulnerable people.
Yeah.
And they're in a position of authority or trust to that person. And those two elements create the problem.
That's fascinating. So, Dan, can you summarize some, let's say, the top 3 points you want our viewers to walk away with in terms of sexual abuse claims, what people should do, what they should not do, people around them? Take it away. Give us 3 top tips.
Okay, so first and foremost is to believe somebody when they tell you they're abused. That's the one thing I learned first, that even when young children, they report that when they were young children, especially in the Catholic clergy cases, they reported to their parents they didn't believe them because they trusted the priest, and the priest had an exalted position in the church. So they weren't believed, and then that priest would go on to abuse other children. So you have to investigate and believe somebody, because people don't typically make that up. So that's number one.
Number one. What's number two?
Number two would be to report it to authorities as
Okay.
soon as you know, or as soon as somebody's willing. And that would be the district attorney for your county or the local police department. And all of those places have professionals who are trained in sexual abuse cases who can, so people shouldn't be afraid to go to them because they have specific attorneys and the district attorney and counselors that work with these survivors. The same with all the police departments that I've exposed to. They're very, very helpful, whether it's Philadelphia, Montgomery, Chester, Delaware County, whatever. And then lastly, if you're going to pursue a case, you need to get to an attorney who has experience in this to handle it and knows the ropes and knows the ins and outs of this particular kind of litigation. It's not something that everybody has done, and you need to be with somebody who knows how to do it.
An experienced sexual abuse attorney.
Correct.
In Pennsylvania.
Yes.
And I'm looking at one right now. And it's so great to have heard all of this information. And for viewers who would like to learn more about Dan, contact Dan. We're going to show his website address right now and hope that you take advantage of calling him because, as he mentioned, consultations are free. In fact, everything is free until the resolution, if there is one. And he will be happy to explain all aspects of the case to you. So again, thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I appreciate it. And again, folks, use the website address on the screen and get any questions you have to Dan. You can call on behalf of yourself, a family member, it doesn't matter. I know you handle everything confidentially, so that's a big boom for people to call as well. And we appreciate your time and advice today. On our next show, we're going to have the pleasure of having one of the area's top employment lawyers here to answer questions about the current situation, post-COVID workplace, including testing rules, vaccination rules, and more that may affect you at the workplace. This show will be of interest to anyone who runs a business or is an employee of a business and has questions. Everybody's got questions today. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you very soon. Dan, thanks again.
Have a nice afternoon. Thank you.